on this computer, and we are admitting the whole crew. Nice. Welcome, everybody.
Happy Mother's Day.
Happy Mother's Day.
Yeah, hopefully you're not all in trouble for scooting off. Although I always argue with my wife that she's not my mother. And I did phone my mom and say hi, so I'm not the worst person on the planet. Oh, Heidi's still in San Francisco. Oh, Paul's gone. He's moved to the other side of his property with the lake in the background. I recognize that shot of Patterson Lake's boat launch and dock there. Who dat? That's Hal. Hal's been there.
I've been paying attention to some flies that are being entered in the group, and some of them I want to say are fantastic.
Yeah, do you take orders?
Yeah, seriously.
All right. So tonight we're talking indicators, indicator techniques.
Bobber techniques.
Boobers.
So we're going to go over, why, when, how, where you're going to be fishing them. Just one sec. Let me back out of this a second.
Well, that's not what you want. You want that?
So yeah, we're going to be talking about why you should be fishing them, when you're going to fish them, where you're going to fish them, how to choose different indicators, because there are instances in which the type of indicator that you're using actually will play a pretty, have a pretty dramatic effect on even fish behavior sometimes, especially in really shallow, clear water. We're going to go over all that. Definitely talk a lot about the leaders, because the leader structure and the construction of your leader has so much to do with this, and we'll explain why. We've got a couple of really good slides on it. When, the pros and cons, because there are times when, fishing without an indicator can sometimes be more productive. How to produce fewer tangles. We can't say you're going to produce zero, but you're definitely going to produce fewer. And then, some people had asked last night, hey, can we still do a retrieve with the indicator? And the answer is yes, absolutely. So so going forward, Phil,
yep,
the mic is yours.
So why would you want to use an indicator anyway? First of all, because the indicator literally suspends your fly beneath a bobber or a float, because that's all an indicator is. It's a lot more fancy though in fly fishing, as we mentioned last night. So your fly just stays up off the bottom. So if you're fishing into over a weedy area or areas with lots of sunken rocks or timber or stuff like that, you can literally hang your fly above those things with the peace of mind that you're probably not going to hook them. You can cover shallow water very effectively, because if you cast and retrieve a lot of times, especially if you're fishing slow, at some point, if you're fishing in shallow, your fly is simply going to, no matter, even if it's unweighted, it's going to hit the bottom if you're going super slow. And also, if fish are cruising in shallow water, repeatedly, if you're blind casting, which means you're just fishing to a likely looking area, you don't see any fish, but you suspect fish may be cruising through there, you could inadvertently spook them with repeated casting. The one thing about an indicator, and this plays true when we're fishing, targeting fish that are chasing bait fish in the shallows, is we can drop our flies in there, just let them hang and let the fish find them without the risk. We kind of drop them in there once and then just let them sit and settle. When you're working weed pockets, very similar to snags and fouling, but weed pockets are very productive places to fish, especially in the early spring and late fall when the fish are in shallow there. You can get your flies into those areas and hold them there, because that's where the fish are cruising. You may have a weed pocket that may be 10 or 15 feet in diameter, and that's really the only spot you'll likely hook a fish. And if you drop a 40-foot cast in there, 35 feet or so of your cast is fishing unproductive water. So you can drop a fly in there and let it sit. You can, and this is probably to me the most important. Jordan and I mentioned the other night that depth, getting your flies to the right depth and holding them there, and then being able to totally control your retrieve from basically no retrieve to some sort of retrieve, a hand twist or a strip, and you can really control those things, because most people new to fly fishing tend to struggle with these two. They don't let their flies sink long enough to get to depth and hold them there, and then they tend to retrieve too fast. Well, that either pulls the fly out of the zone you're trying to target or simply moves the fly too fast for the fish to be interested. They're kind of suspicious and won't go near it. Originally, when I started doing this in the early 80s, we used to do it to suggest chironomids, because that was the one food source where depth was really critical to being successful. And then we started hanging other things under there. Leeches. My leech experience came, I'd like to say it was, lots of research and pie charts and graphs and algorithms and trigonometry. It was my 5-year-old, my oldest son, who's 27 now, was about 5 or 6 and was bored fishing a chironomid under an indicator, and was asking for a fly change. He wanted to put a leech on. I was arguing with him, as most parents do. You don't fish those under indicators. And eventually, like any parent, I cracked, tied the fly on just for some peace and quiet. It sat for 30 seconds and went under so hard. At that point, I said, geez, fish are stupid. And then, released the fish for him, flopped it out there again. It happened 7 times in a row. So after that point, I was like, you know what? Maybe hanging leeches under an indicator isn't all that bad. And nowadays, we hang everything: scuds, leeches, damsels, baitfish, attractor patterns, you name it. It'll all work under an indicator. So we use it to suggest a wide array of different prey items.
Yeah, one thing that I've never hung under an indicator that I've seen them tied is it's a dragonfly nymph. I've seen people tying balanced dragons. I just have not got around to that yet.
It works, but I don't do
Yeah.
it very often. I think I much prefer to strip them.
Yeah, I do too.
Yeah,
I just like
it's a
feeling the way
preference
that they
thing.
eat them so much.
Yeah,
Um,
it's a good fly to cover water with because it's big and it stands out over a distance. So.
So basically, when we're going to be fishing indicators, so obviously when the fish are keyed in at a specific depth. So sometimes you'll see, amidst, especially if you have a really prolific emergence taking place, fish will get really particular on where in the water column they're going to be eating. And sometimes it's not so much the fly, it's putting it, I've had days where 12 feet under the indicator and 20 feet of water is the absolute ticket. And this is and another one too, is when early in the season, like right now, when fish are feeding very, very close to the mud, when they're feeding very close to the bottom. I was out a few days ago, and if you weren't within, 12, maybe 18 inches of bottom, you weren't catching fish. And that's just because that's where they're eating those first staging pupa. Now, this is obviously, we talked at the start about, sometimes we do things not very differently. Sometimes we do things differently and doesn't make anybody correct or incorrect, but I will fish indicators up to about 30 feet of water. And that's only because I find, when you're fishing them free swimming out in that deep water, they take it really hard. And so if I'm fishing, 25 feet of water, 20 feet down, I find usually the takes are pretty savage. And I just like seeing the indicator go down out in that deep water. But typically, they're not ideal for fishing super deep water. My rule is if I'm in deeper than 30 feet, I'm going to a sinking line. And even sometimes if I'm in, if I have to fish anything longer than maybe 25 feet of leader, that's getting a little bit on the long side for me. So the nice thing too is a lot of times you will have, and actually, you know what, just to iterate kind of what I'm talking about, I am going to share my screen for a second, because this is a really prime example of what this slide talks about with fishing pockets in weed beds. So this is, let me just see if I can get on here. Okay, perfect. I'm just going to brighten my screen a little bit. There we go. Okay, I'm just going to share for a second here. So sometimes you have to be very, very particular in so let's say you're fishing so can you see that, Phil?
Yeah.
Thumbs up. Okay, perfect. So this is super quick, but so you see these two little dimples in, so this flat here is maybe Oh, when the water's up, it's maybe 3.5 feet deep. And I mean, if you're in a float tube, like you are kicking people that have phobias about things underwater wouldn't do well in this situation because you're kicking for like 100 yards with weeds touching all over your feet. But these are two little depressions here, and these actually hold some really big fish sometimes because this is a safe zone for them. I'm going to zoom. I don't know if I can zoom in on those a little bit. Oh, just 1 second here. So basically, fishing an indicator in this situation is extremely efficient because there's not really any other way to have the fly sit in there for any extended period of time. These are only like 10 feet by 10 feet. So what you're doing is anchoring on the outside of them. And these are just two small depressions on a giant flat. And they're only about 10 feet deep, but that 10 feet in depth, fish will cruise over this hump and they'll go in here. Fishing with an indicator is literally the only way that I know of that you can keep it, sitting catatonic in that little depression for an indefinite, amount of time, or a fairly long period of time before you have to pick it up and cast. If you're trying to cast and retrieve in there, I mean, you'd spend all day just pulling weeds off of your line. The nice thing about them, I love the term set it and forget it, because when you're fishing with people that are new to lake fishing, or people that, they don't want to do a whole bunch of casting, you can get them set up with an indicator rig and they're fishing effectively, especially when you tell them the less you can do with this, the better it's going to do for the most part. And the final point on this is when we're fishing, in British Columbia, we can fish 2 rods. So a lot of times I'll be fishing a naked line on one side and I'll be doing a hand twist. And then I'll just hang something else under the indicator. Or let's say we're fishing in the fall. I'll have maybe a leech under my indicator, and then I can cast and retrieve a scud on a sinking line. So it's just nice. Allows you, it would be almost impossible to be running 2 naked lines simultaneously because it's nice to have your hand on it while you're fishing. So these are just a couple key areas when indicators are advantageous.
So we're going to go through now. Most people I think today use the bottom one there, the quick release style indicators, and we'll get to those. But there are other types. Some of them we use because, going back before quick release indicators, it's all we had. But there are situations where all of these can play a role, and it's good to have a cross section of indicator types in your kit bag. And the first one up is a dry fly, which most people are, I think if you fished rivers or streams, you may be familiar with the term dry dropper, where you literally have a dry fly that floats on the surface down through the river. And underneath of that, you typically most tie onto a section of tippet onto the bend of the hook and hang a small nymph under there. So it's a 2-for-1 kind of presentation. The fish could take the nymph, the fish could take the dropper. Now I like to fish if you remember from the leaders session we did, I like to fish my flies on independent droppers, but you can still fish dry droppers that way. So the beauty of this is if you've got fish near the surface or in shallow that will come up and take a dry fly, you've got the benefit of that. And if they take the chironomid pupa or a small leech or whatever you're hanging underneath, that dry fly now serves as an indicator because it'll just be sitting out there and all of a sudden it sinks, it's gone. That means a fish has pulled it under. So you get a 2-for-1 deal. There's 2 ways you can do this. You can do dry dropper, where the dropper is sort of on the dropper fly, and the point fly, the fly furthest away from the fly line, is your subsurface pattern, a chironomid pupa, a damselfly nymph, whatever you want to hang. Or a washing line setup where you would have the dry fly on the point, and then your nymph or your pupa, whatever you're fishing as a dropper, in between that dry fly and the fly line. And this is a great way, let's say in a mayfly hatch, where you've got fish in the upper 2 feet of water, rising up to, just cruising along, rising up to eat the adults, and also picking off any nymphs that are ascending up to the surface to hatch. So what you're doing here is, because the fish are cruising in that zone, you've got the dry fly at the surface, and in combination with your floating line and the dry fly, that's going to hold your nymph to imitate an emerging nymph in the zone they're cruising. So it can work very well. So typically something like this is a, it's on my YouTube channel just a few releases ago called the Hoe Candy. It's just big, it's visible. It may not match the hatch, but at least you can see it and it'll just pull under. So there are some cons to this thing. It's not legal everywhere. It's generally limited to the shallows, simply because if you get any more than about a rod length, or preferably a foot shorter, that's how long you got to keep it. Because if you hook a fish on the dropper, you can't land the fish because now the dry fly is stuck in your rod tip, right? So it's generally a shallow water presentation, but it is fun. It's a 2-for-1 deal. It's obviously I do it in provinces and states where I can fish 2 dries, and when fishing near the surface, feeding on both adults, emergers, and emerging pupa or nymphs.
Yeah, and I wish so badly sometimes that we could fish the dry dropper here.
You should fish
Because,
droppers anywhere. You don't know what you're missing.
well, I know that's why I love going to Alberta, because I can fish a Chernobyl ant, and then I can fish a pheasant tail. And how many are you allowed 3 flies?
3 flies in Alberta. I mostly fish 2. I
Yeah.
find when you put the 3rd on, and I'm usually in a desperate state of mind at that point, I'm trying to cover as much water as I can by literally hanging them at different levels.
Yeah.
Adding that 3rd fly just it seems to take the tangle coefficient off into double digits. So it's kind of a last resort kind of proposition that I'm doing.
So, I'm gonna talk quickly about yarn indicators. So we'll fish these quite a bit. I'll fish these. I actually have kind of a strange scenario in which I love to fish yarn indicators. I don't fish them a lot, to be totally honest. I'll fish them a lot of times in shallow water, and I'll fish them, to fish that are very, very aware of their surroundings. So there's a few variations. Phil, you got the O-ring ones?
Yeah, I'm just trying to, if people can see my
Yeah.
camera.
Perfect.
While you're talking, I'm just showing here with the loop how you thread these things on.
Yeah, and if you can stop your share if you want to, and that'll blow your screen up.
Literally?
Yeah, and I can just I can just read off of the notes here. So, so when you're fishing a yarn indicator, they're nice because they make literally no noise when they land. They just make, they're so delicate. They're quite buoyant. I mean, surprisingly buoyant. I started using them and still use them mostly in rivers. These are a true strike indicator. This is not a bobber. These are not designed to suspend, these aren't designed to suspend heavy presentations at a fixed depth.
Yeah, they'd struggle with a balanced leech because the leech weighs so much with that tungsten bead.
Yeah. So, Sharon said Phil's gone. Can you guys see Phil's screen?
Where have I gone?
Yeah, no, you should be okay.
Where have I gone? Can everybody else see me, or is it just Sharon? Okay, Eric can see me.
Sorry. Maybe when I start talking, I take over the screen. I'm not too sure. Okay. So, so another nice thing is they will sit at a fixed position. They'll sit at a fixed position on your leader. So I will use these, and this is kind of strange, but I will actually use these quite a bit when I'm fishing dry flies. So sometimes when you have a big hatch of, especially calabatus, when you've got them just tenting up all over the place, sometimes what I'll do is I'll put a small yarn indicator. If I'm fishing a 12-foot leader, I'll put a small yarn indicator at just at the top of my leader, about 10 feet back, and what that does for me is lessens the number of times that I'm going to set the hook when I think that a fish is boiled next to my fly. Because sometimes, fishing a small Adams and there's mayflies popping all over the place, you kind of lose sight of which one is yours. And I've definitely had plenty of times where a fish will come up and gulp, and I'll lift up and set the hook, and of course it ate the bug right next to mine. Also, that's a great time to change flies. But I'll actually use this if I'm fishing a dry fly that I can't see. If I'm fishing a dry that I can't see, and I'll actually use this truly as a strike indicator. This has helped me a lot fishing fish keyed in on adult chironomids or small mayflies and actually taking the adult. One thing like Phil's doing here, this can definitely kink your leader quite easily.
If you take it off, it puts a set, particularly in nylon. And of course, once you set it, you can't move it. So it's tough to fish these in deep water. There's a little bit of a set starting to take place there, but after a few changes, these things can look, your leader gets all kind of fouled up. So, all right.
Oh yeah, that's right. We should have gone to gallery mode. We got some pretty zoom savvy people on here,
Yeah,
I
I
think.
don't know why I'm not in gallery mode, but whatever.
So yeah, so anyways, and then the next one would be, so we'll fish sometimes like a
Whoops.
like a thingamabobber, or corkies. Basically these are designed not to free slide on your leader. So yeah, perfect. So the
I will
thingamabobber,
do my stop share thing again. So yeah, these attach just like the yarn indicators do. This is a thingamabobber, little plastic full of air.
they're nice. They so same thing, they can kind of kink your leader a little bit, but definitely they are really they are really nice when you know that you're not going to be pegging over and over and over, and you know for sure that you're not going to be fishing any length that's greater than your kind of a rod length. So if you're fishing in 5 or 6 feet of water and you're going to be fishing 5 or 6 feet of water, you don't need that quick release mechanism. So it's nice just to have something that sits in a fixed position. You don't have to keep pegging it over and over and over.
And you can get them in white too, so they're kind of unobtrusive, as opposed to something in the hot orange category that a fish might be alerted to in shallow
Yeah.
water.
So they do
Yeah,
have a time and place for
yeah.
sure.
And the other thing I like about them too is you could be fishing your naked line with something, and all of a sudden decide to want to change over to an indicator. And one of the drawbacks of a quick release is you got to thread it on the leader, kind of basically take everything apart, thread it on. You can add and subtract these in a blink of an eye, right, to deal with a specific situation. And then perhaps 10 minutes later, you're going to take that indicator off and fish something else.
And they make those really small.
Yeah.
Those thingamabobbers, I mean, they make them just tiny, and they make almost no noise when they hit the water. They're really quite
Well,
nice.
the other thing we mentioned there, Jordan, was the corky style.
Yeah.
Which is here. And the corky styles, this is what I used to use before quick release indicators were on the market. That's all we had. And the bicolored ones were nice. So meaning there's 2 colors on this thing. So if I set this up, when I set it up, so this orange side is looking at me. So when I cast it, it lands and I can see the orange side. And then I make a cast and I kind of screw it up. And all of a sudden I'm looking at this color. That's a great signal you've got a tangle. And if you identify it early, you can probably fix it. It might have just caught around the toothpick, because a toothpick was used to hold these in place. And then as we got more savvy with these things, a toothpick being stiff could catch the leader. So we would take rubber bands and cut a 2-inch section and put that bobbin threader that Jordan mentioned you carry in your kit bag. Once you get this indicator where you want to put it on the leader, slide the bobbin threader through, grab the rubber band and literally pull it into the indicator, and that would wedge in and hold the indicator in place. And because the ends sticking out of the rubber band are flexible, it wouldn't tangle as much. So that's the old style corkies.
Yeah.
All right, back to square one again. And then these twist lock indicators came along, and am I back on big screen again?
We're in gallery view. Yeah.
Okay.
You can keep talking.
Yeah. So this is the twist lock. It's very similar to the thingamabobber, but what these have is you take this little nut off, this little plastic nut, and it's threaded. And this, it's hard to see, but it has a little V notch in it. And you literally would take your leader material like so, slide it in between the notch, and then take your washer and carefully thread it on. Of course, one of the drawbacks of this indicator would be you drop the washer, you're kind of pooched. But the beauty of this is it tends not to kink the indicator, right? And you snug it up and it's tightened. And then if you want to move it, you just undo the washer a little bit and it slides back and forth. So when I go to, these are, what I like these is they're really good in the wind because they're light enough to cast, whereas, a heavier corky style or quick release has a bit more weight to it, a bit more mass, I should probably say. And it can cause a hinge point and cause tangles. So when I go down to Argentina, where, you know, a calm day is 40 miles an hour, these are a lot more fun to cast in those situations and tangle less than a traditional indicator. Plus, there's a lot of times down there that we may fish an indicator for half an hour and then we go back to stripping, right? And it's all floating line work down there because we're fishing very shallow. So I can easily remove this from my leader and go back to stripping. Like I could be hanging a scud, no luck with it, take this off and decide to strip it for a while, right? So it's very adaptable. So I always have a few of these, and like the thingamabobbers, they come in little sizes from the size of a, you know, a pea to some the size, it seems, of a golf ball. So a very handy one to have in your kit bag as well. All right.
Yeah, those, I love those airlocks. They're I've only started using them in the last few years, but they are really a great product.
They went off the market for a while. This is the old style. They've now got a newer biodegradable one. I don't know what happened. There was some issue with the product itself. I don't know whether it was falling apart or ducks are choking on it. I don't know. But they were pulled off the market for a little while, and they recently re-released them. Like I would say in the last few months, they came up back out again. So they're a handy one to have in your bag. Can everybody see that screen again?
Yep.
Okay. And then, of course, there is the quick release indicator. And these became really popular because for the first time, they allowed us to easily fish in water where our flies were hanging more than a rod length from the indicator. Because as we said with all the other ones, one of the primary issues is when you catch a fish that the indicator would become a barrier to landing it because it's stuck up at the rod tip. So the way these work, if you're not familiar with them, is there is a little black peg, and I'll stop the share so you can see this. There's a little black peg, and you thread the, and I actually, will explain this in a second, but this may look a little goofy, but I prefer to have the peg on the fly side of the leader, not the fly line, okay? And this is to stop tangles, is one of the reasons, because as your leader, when you're making a cast, if you imagine when it goes to lay out, it's going to roll away from the indicator and not likely to catch. If this was on the other side and you tailed the loop, this could catch, tumble the indicator and create a tangle. The other reason we do it like this, when this releases, or if you break a fish off, there's nothing stopping this all from sliding off and the black peg sinks and your indicator drifts up into the sunset. But as Jordan's going to explain in a second, we use a lot of swivels in our indicator setups, and the swivel acts as a stopper. So if the swivel was here where my thumb and forefinger is, right, because a break off occurs either on the section below the swivel or right at the fly, of course, you setting and the fish breaking is going to trip this indicator. It's just going to slide down, hit your swivel, and you know you haven't lost anything. So to set these things, once you get it where you want it, you're going to disengage the peg, and I like to go about 1 inch or 2, and then just push it back. I actually will hold the leader in my hand here so it can't move, and that causes this leader here to buckle, this nice chartreuse Berkeley trilene. And when you push it back and it forms a loop, you pinch that loop like so against the indicator. So this loop is pinched, sandwiched between the black peg and the foam indicator itself. And when it comes under tension of you setting the hook and the fish saying, I don't like that, and going the other way, it pops. So this slides, once you get a take, will slide up and down the leader. So now we can fish 25 feet below an indicator and it'll trip. And now that you can land that fish, no care, no muss, no fuss. It's really nice and taking all that anguish away of now what? I've hooked the fish 15 feet down and I can't land it because my dry fly is going to get stuck at the rod tip or my corky or my thingamabobber or yarn or whatever. These were a game changer for deep water indicator fishing, right? In the past, we either had to use a corky with a toothpick and at some point in the fight, reach in and bite the toothpick out. Usually that ended up, it took a while to get it, because as soon as you got that indicator in your hands to bite the toothpick out, you got so focused on this, when the fish is pulling, you, screw you, I want this, and ping, you break it off, right? and you had to play a bit of a game at some point in the fight. You've got to try and grab this and get it off, which was always problematic. So once these came out, these have sort of changed the indicator game in still waters. The drawback to them is they're a little heavier than the other indicators. Just a sec here. Let's get back on share screen. They're a little heavier, and you've got to thread them on first, right? So that means there is some loss of portability, I guess you could say. So if you wanted to change to a cast and retrieve presentation, you'd have to take your swivel, your flies off, slide this off, and then tie everything back up again. But most times when I fish these, this is a dedicated indicator rod I'm fishing, and that's all it's going to be all day long. Rarely will I take it apart unless naked fishing is lights out, and then if I'm in BC, I'll have both naked rods out or something like that. But most times when I rig up an indicator rod, it stays an indicator rod all day. This is the indicator Jordan and I use, I'd say 80–85% of the time. The other ones are there for those those single scenarios where, geez, it's nice to have something different, or you're on a travel trip or something like that where you want the other ones. So there's always the question. Everybody seems to be looking for a silver bullet solution. Is there one indicator type or color? Unfortunately, the answer is no. There are some definite preferences that come in, but light conditions have an effect, because under certain light conditions, certain colors stand out better. The water's surface has a lot to do with it as well. The more choppy it is, the bigger the indicator you're going to use. I do like to use the smallest indicators I can get away with, because I feel they're a little more sensitive, and they'll also stop me from bombing long distance casts out because I can't see them. So the natural inclination is, you want to see your indicator, you got to bring it in closer. Obviously, people see colors differently. Some person says, I hate bright green, I can't see it. Another person says, I love bright yellow, I can see that all day long. How deep you're fishing has an effect, because if you remember, we talked about the yarn indicators, the dry droppers, thingamabobbers. They're limited basically to a rod length between indicator and fly you can fish. Otherwise, that indicator is going to get in the way from you landing the fish, because it gets stuck at the rod tip during the end of the fight. Pattern weight has an effect. If you're fishing heavy balanced flies, a little itty bitty indicator like this is going to get pulled under, right? Or run flush in the surface and become difficult to see. Water clarity we talked about, that's when a yarn indicator might be a better choice, or a very small light thingamabobber. And fish mood. And I've experienced this, and this refers to your indicator shape. So I'm just going to stop share for a second so you can see this. So this is a tapered indicator, and these are the round ball style. And most times, 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. But I've had situations, particularly when they're eating chironomids and they're eating small ones. So a fish doesn't have to expend a lot of effort to eat a chironomid. It just kind of sucks it in and moves on to the next one. So these sit flush on the surface, and I've had takes when they're taken soft. The only sign of a take is this indicator goes like a Snoopy bobber from horizontal to vertical and lays back down again. Because if you ever watch how one of these goes down, if you're fishing like a bigger fly, like a balanced leech or something, that they're going to usually give it a good pull because it's bigger. They're going to expend a little more energy to eat it. This always stands and then goes down. But when they take a chironomid, right, softly, this is going to stand, and as soon as now it's starting to come under tension. As soon as they feel that tension, they don't like it. They know something's not right, and they let go. So they let go, it lays back down again, right? So that's a little clue if they're taking soft when I might put a tapered on. I get lots of questions sometimes as I drop the tapered on the floor. Which do I prefer? It's usually, it doesn't matter. It's whatever one is closest. But if they're taken really soft, then I may lean towards a tapered as a trick to try and get, again, it'll sit like this, go up and then down, or it'll sit up and then lay down again. That's a take. You missed it. You didn't even see it go under or feel it. So just a handy thing to have there.
Yeah, so narrow end, sorry, you want the thick end of the tapered peg pointing at your fly, just to clarify that.
Yeah.
Because I've had with, size 18 chironomids, when you have the thick end of the peg facing up towards the loop on the fly line, where that whole thing will just, your indicator will slide right off. It'll slide right over top of it. So it's nice to have that, that insurance there. People like Jason just said, is the, you know, the round one or the bell shape the best? I fish the round ones quite often, but like Phil was saying, if they're taking them really light, sometimes that indicator will do a bit of a wheelie before anything. When they're just swimming around, when it's early season, maybe the water's cold, they're just swimming super slow, and what they're going to do is basically just swim up to your fly, close their mouth, and just mouth it for a second,
Yeah.
and you're going to see your indicator, you know, either wiggle a little bit or just barely stand up. Oh, sorry. Hal says, so the indicator itself, the fat end to the rod or to the fly.
The fat end to the rod. So
Yeah.
like
a bobber.
Like this. That's the rod. That's the fly. Right? This
With the
is
bell shaped.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the tapered end towards the fly, but the peg towards the fly too.
Yeah.
Dropping indicators everywhere here. I saw a question too. What size do I use? I try to get away with the smallest I can, as I said earlier. First of all, I think they're a little more sensitive because it's less effort for a fish to pull that bobber down. And it also disciplines you, or helps discipline you, to keep your cast close to you.
Mhm.
Because you don't want to, this is the one presentation, you don't want to be bombing out casts across the planet, because the takes can be very subtle. So when you have a small indicator, you cast it far away, it's hard to see, you're going to pull it towards you. My general rule as well is the bigger the chop, the bigger the bobber. So the choppier it is, the bigger the bobber, because it's harder to see when there's a big swell and all kinds of things. And I'll be honest, I probably fish most often, this is the large size in the ball, and this is the medium. These are the two sizes I fish the most. If it's a calm day, light ripple, fishing small bugs, chironomids, mayfly nymphs, I probably go with the medium. If it's a big chop, or I'm fishing balance leeches or anything with a tungsten bead on it or something big, then I'm going to need a bigger bobber to hold it up. Or if the chop's a little more aggressive, I'm going to be able to see this better.
I fish those ones the most, I think.
Yeah, so I fish the large probably most often, followed by the mediums, because most of the times the wind's going.
Yeah.
Got indicators all over the floor in my office.
So
Yeah.
we're going to talk about leader setup, because this is absolutely imperative. Now, I know that we've kind of covered this a little bit, but I really want to go in depth on this for a minute. And Phil and I can both tell you stories. I mean, we can tell you stories, but we can tell you about times where we've seen two people fishing the exact same thing, the exact same fly, exact same leader length. They're both pegged at, 8 feet or 12 feet, and one person's catching and one person's not. And the reason for this is, and a lot of times you'll get sold in a fly shop a traditional tapered leader, right? So they'll say, oh, you want to fish? So I used to think, okay, I'm going to fish a long leader. I'm going to fish a 15-foot leader. Well, I'll start with a 15-foot tapered leader, and then I can pretty much just tie my swivel onto that, and then, a little bit of tippet below it. But there's a huge problem with this. And I was fishing, how this started for me was fishing next to a friend of mine one day. This was 2010. And I was down to my last tapered leader. And I can't remember. Oh, I got a giant bird's nest just taking it out of the package. And I was so frustrated. I had just this ball of mono in front of me. And I said, man, I don't have any tapered leaders left. And he said, oh, you use tapered leaders for chironomid fishing? And I said, yeah. And he said, I stopped doing that years ago. He said, I just run 8-pound test to my swivel, and then I run 5 or 6 pound or maybe 8 pound below it. And I thought, that's crazy. I said, nobody does that. And now I mean, most people that I know do it, but it was his reasoning was that the leader sinks faster and it hangs straighter. And I'm definitely a huge advocate for this. And definitely so this is a great example, right? So these leaders are going to be the same length, but you see that thicker yellow part is the tapered end. And you have to remember that on a tapered leader, most of them, 50% of the leader is butt section, because they're actually designed for dry fly fishing. They're not designed for anything but. So that thicker part of that leader there, that's designed for turnover, right? But the first thing I asked him was, how do you cast? Isn't it ugly? And he said, isn't it ugly all the time when you're casting 20 feet of leader and a swivel and a strike indicator and a fly? And so I guess so. So this really got me onto the level leader setup, and I never went back. And so now what we use quite often are indicator leaders. And basically what an indicator leader is a very, so let's say you have a 12-foot leader, which most of them are, you'll have about a 24-inch section, max 24 inches of thicker line, of thicker butt section. That's basically just to create a transition from the fly line into the leader. And the rest of it is going to be thin mono. If you are going to use the level leader setup, definitely make sure you have a piece of shock tippet in between the fly line and the leader, because tying 6 or 8 pound fluorocarbon right to the fly line is going to shred the coating really quickly. And then what starts to happen is that those fly lines, a floating line, can get waterlogged quite easily once water can seep in underneath that. Once it can seep in underneath the coating and start to hit the core. So definitely have. So usually what I'll have is, and you might want to write this down, but I'll put it in the group tonight too. Is or tomorrow when we send out the notes and the recording. So basically, I will take 12-pound Maxima Ultra Green, and what I'll do is I will tie a perfection loop. And then, so I'll take maybe a foot-long piece. I'll tie a perfection loop in one end, and basically just pinch right above that perfection loop, and I'll tie another one right above it, keeping the shortest, and usually you've only got like 3 inches, maybe 2 inches in between your two loops. Then I'll loop one of those to the fly line, and now I've got something that I can loop to loop with that thin mono or that thin fluoro without damaging the coating on that floating line. And the 12-pound Ultra Green or 10-pound Ultra Green, and I use Ultra Green because it's thick. And it's thick, but it's also quite supple. It's not crazy stiff. It's not like Maxima Chameleon. And that's basically it. And that little piece of 10 or 12 pound with the 2 perfection loop's a very, very small knot. So it goes in and out of the guides, no problem. And yeah, I really, like this diagram shows here, I'm definitely am an advocate for the level leader setup for sure.
Yeah, I had the same thing Jordan's talking about. I had 2 clients on my boat, one catching, one not. Usual progressions, what fly, what size, what depth. It got to the point, let's compare by putting the 2 indicators together and literally stroking them from the indicator to the fly, and they were to the millimeter the same depth. But one leader was level all the way, and that was the person who was catching the fish. The other one was thick, and then I could feel it taper into thin. And we got him to change up to the indicator leaders styles we're going to show you in a second. And he started catching fish immediately, because even though they're both set at like 10 feet, like in this diagram, 10 feet from indicator to fly, 10 feet from indicator to fly. But because of that thick butt section in the tapered leader, which as Jordan said, is designed to aid turnover when you're fishing dry flies to feeding fish on the surface, thick stuff sinks slower than thin stuff. I got it out.
Everybody's got to try to say that at least once.
Yeah. There's your tongue tweezer for tonight. So even though both were set at that same depth, they weren't actually hanging there. And when fish are eating small bugs, their strike zone gets really small because they're not going to waste any effort moving up and down in the water. They're just going to eat whatever's straight in front of them, because there's 250,000 of them right there. And that fish would have just cruised right by, and there goes my fish, and eats the
Bobber
fly
down.
that's hanging straight and bobber down. So they're both doing the same thing. Everything looks similar. As humans, we always are good at figuring out the obvious stuff. It's the subtle changes that make the difference, right? And that's the key. The most critical part of tonight's session is understanding how we do these leaders. So the first one I'm going to show you, and Jordan's going to show you more of the level. You've got 2 basic options. So this first one is those indicator or nymphing style leaders. This is the one I use. It's 10 foot long out of the package. I tend to use the 2X 10 pounds all the time. And this one has the short butt section that runs from here, from where you loop it onto the fly line. And because it's thicker there, it won't bite in. They are advertised as a tapered leader, but the taper is only 36 to 24 inches. So when I put the indicator on, between my indicator and my fly line, I have a little backbone. It'll help turn it over, because this is the most tangle-prone system we fish in lakes, because you've got multiple points of weight. You got an indicator, you got a swivel, you've got two flies maybe, or one fly with a bead head on it. All of those things like to do their own thing when they're in the air, and that's what tends to cause tangles, because they're all trying to go their own separate directions. But between my indicator and my fly line, my indicator and my fly, this is level. Even though it looks thicker here, it's just to show it's different. And so let's say I want to fish. These are 10 feet long. So the distance from here to here is 10 feet. So if I want to fish deeper than about 7 feet, because remember, 3 feet of this is thick. We don't fish this part. This never gets under the water. It sits on the water. So from here down, I've got 7 workable feet. Well, obviously, if I want to fish 15 feet down, I've got to add some leader. I'm never going to get there. So what I do is I add a section of leader, right? So let's say I want to hit 16 feet. I have 7 feet here, right? So 16 less 7 is 9, isn't it? Yes.
That was good. That was quick.
That was good. Not bad. I still got my socks on. And then I always like my final tippet section from here to here to be on average 24 inches long. I may go a little deeper if I'm fishing deep, like 18, 19, 20 some odd feet down, right? I like to keep that short. So let's say that's 2 feet. So 9 less 2, I've got to add 7 feet of leader before I get to my swivel. So this is what I call my adjustment zone from here to here. So I would add that 7 feet, and it's either the same diameter tippet as the end of this leader, or maybe one size less. Frankly, it's whatever I grab first, right? There's no hard and fast rule. Equal or slightly less, one size less. So I would just do a triple surgeon's knot here, add 7 feet approximately. That would be clinch knotted to my swivel. And then from my swivel down 2 feet is my fluorocarbon tippet, right? And this is I call it the adjustment zone, because if you fish deep for a while and then Jordan says, hey, Phil, they're feeding in 5 feet of water now, I am going to go obviously where Jordan is and try and steal all the fish off of him I can, right? But I don't want to be casting a 16-foot leader where I only need to have a leader that'll get me to 5 feet. You don't cast any longer leader than you need to. So then I would cut this leader back so I could effectively fish shallow. That's why I call it the adjustment zone, because I either add between my swivel and the main leader or subtract between my swivel and the main leader, because I really don't want to start cutting into this leader, because they're more expensive and you just end up, after a few changes, if you kind of turn a 10-foot leader into a 6-foot leader. And then I always like to keep this final section. So that's why I call this my adjustment zone. Hopefully that makes sense.
That actually makes quite a bit of sense.
Okay, I don't see any chats, so either
no malicious comments either.
No malicious comments. So I see a question, at the risk of losing Rio sponsorship, tie your own. Yes, we're going to talk about that, Jackson. And SA also makes these lines.
Leaders, right? They do.
The reason I like these is not just the Rio thing, but I like the little bit of backbone in here that helps, because Jordan and I guide a lot of people that haven't fished before or not used to this kind of thing. So I am looking for anything to help with them not get frustrated with tangling, because thin level leaders will work. I'm going to show that in a second, but they're more tangle prone. They take a little bit more practice, a little bit more experience to use. And the fact that the loop on here is thicker, like Jordan said in that little section he makes, it won't bite into the fly line. I'm not going to have a $10 item or a $5 item screwing up a $90 or $100 item.
Yeah, that's pretty good. And one thing that I want to touch on with that is I will almost always have heavier braking strength. So my favorite is running 8-pound down to the swivel and then 6 below it. And the reason for that is if I'm going to break a fish off at any point, I'm only going to lose what's below my swivel. I'm not running the risk of
That's kind of your fusible link, if you will, to use an electrical term. That you want your leader is always built to break at the farthest end, because you really don't want it to bust up in the middle, because
or at the top.
You got to rebuild the whole thing. As a questioner, what do I mean by size? 1x. So 2x on here, I would add 3x or another section of 2x in my adjustment zone. And in my final tippet section, quite often I start at 3x. I like to get away with as heavy as I can get away with, right? So I can horse those fish in.
Yeah.
All right, Jordan's up with the level section of fluorocarbon.
Yeah, so usually what we'll do with, I love this setup because you get, I mean, you just get such a vertical hang with it. And, you know, when you're fishing this type of a setup anyways, it doesn't really, there's nothing that's really going to hinder your casting all that much, because the casting is pretty, you know, it's not wondrous to watch as it is. So basically what I'll have is, like I said, that piece of 10 or 12 pound, ultra green, at the top with a perfection loop on either side. So usually for my setup, usually what I'm doing is running 8-pound fluorocarbon down straight off of that little piece of shock tippet, that little piece of shock loop, 8-pound fluorocarbon down to my swivel. And then from my swivel, I'm usually running, I fish 4X, 6.5 pound, I think, or 6.7. I don't know what it is. But yeah, roughly 6-pound test. I very rarely in lakes break fish off with 6-pound tests. The only time is usually when they hit it and I'm not looking, or, you know, I have a bit of a handle on the fly line, and they just hit it going the opposite direction. I've definitely been broken off a few times like that, but, or the line obviously gets caught around something. But for the most part, I mean, 6-pound test, when you look at, when you look at, and a lot of this too depends on fishing pressure. I've definitely had times where bumping down from 3X to 4X has a huge difference. And then from 4X again down to 5X, you start noticing even fish will bite, you know, on a more regular basis. So much of this has to do with water clarity and angling pressure. I had one last thing oh yes. So if I want to go from this level leader setup with, to naked line, the nice thing is all I have to do is clip at my swivel, adjust my leader length according, obviously slide the indicator off, and then just, you know, double or triple surgeons on a short piece of, because I can tie 6-pound to this 8-pound piece of level leader, or even 10-pound piece of level leader. It's very easy. I don't have to put any other middle sections in.
You can do that with both. You can do that with both.
100%.
My naked leader is different than Jordan's. So tomorrow night when we talk naked,
when we
talk about naked, talk naked, I'll clarify that. You'll see there's differences. And again, that's one of the principles of this class. Don't get stuck in a track of only doing something one way. There's lots of different ways to get the same result. Just before we move on, a couple of questions here I want to talk to. We'll talk about swivels in a second. You could use a tippet ring if you wanted to. The trouble with a tippet ring, if we were to go back to here, because these are on my leader setup, is the tippet ring would be here potentially. Yes, it would save the integrity of this leader, but the hole in the black peg won't pass over a tippet ring. So depending on how deep you're fishing, that could stop your leader, your indicator here, and you may not be able to land the fish because there's simply too much leader between the indicator now and the balance of the leader to get it in. It's jammed up at the rod tip. At the leader to adjustment zone, doesn't the knot stop the bobber stopper? The bobber stopper? We'll talk about bobber stoppers in a second. No, because when we're using bobber stoppers, they're on this side of the indicator. They're not on this side. And I just use a triple surgeon's knot here because it's a low profile knot and it will pass through the black peg on an indicator quite easily. When we talk naked, yeah, somebody caught that. What happens in the group stays in the group. Okay.
We can't go to Vegas right now, so this is the closest thing.
Yeah, we can't. We're not even going there. So swivels, Jordan.
I like. Okay, so I will fish. Yeah, those are the exact ones that I fish. So I really won't change. I won't change the size of them a ton. Usually I'll fish either a 12 or a 14, basically whatever I have. I fish a 12 actually the most. And I just like, you know, whatever advantage I can give myself to get that presentation hanging vertical, especially when you've got, you know, when it's a bit bumpy out on the water. I do find that I do think that a heavier swivel will keep the, yeah, it anchors it down there, right? So that indicator going up and down, it kind of absorbs a lot of that shock. Originally, this is what I was told, was originally that chronomid fishing, this swivel was introduced because people were sick of buying fluorocarbon, because they had problems with, especially, I don't hear this as much anymore, but people having issues tying fluorocarbon and monofilament together. So in order to separate the mono and the fluoro, they started using a barrel swivel. I don't know if that's true or not. I heard that when I started
Yeah,
working.
there's still some of that is to do with how you're tying your knots a little bit. You
Big
might
time,
be, you know,
huge.
not moistening and drawing them too
Oh,
fast
there's that
together.
word again.
Pull a knot slowly together. It'll because it's the heat that weakens, and harder fluoro can bite into softer nylon or
Yeah.
mono, and that's what causes the separation anxiety.
And obviously you are, you know, okay, so this is something that, Phil, do you change the color of your swivels ever?
Well,
Yeah, okay, okay.
I've
So
had discussions about designing multicolored swivels for different reasons.
so when you are, and this, I'll give you a quick example. So I'll fish 3 different types of swivels. So I'll fish a gunmetal, I'll fish a gold, and I'll fish a silver.
It's exactly what
Um,
I do.
yeah.
Yeah.
So not all at the same time, obviously. So so I'll fish, most of the time I've got a gunmetal one on. But if I'm in kind of a darker, more tea-stained lake and there's lots of chironomids coming up, I'll start to play around with the gold and I'll start to play around with the chrome. And a lot of times they'll bump those swivels thinking that they're chironomids. So this is the best example that I have of this. I was fishing quite a clear lake. This was 2011. This was June 7th, 2011. And I was fishing 20 feet of water, and it was right, I'd had pretty slow fishing to start the day. I actually went and I actually picked up and moved lakes, and I got to this lake. It was teetering into the evening, and obviously in June it's light quite late, so I'm fishing at about 6:30 p.m. and I have a leech on one line and I have a scud on another line, and my indicator keeps going down and popping right back up. And as soon as I grab the rod, as soon as I go to make the hook set, nothing. And I mean, I miss like 10 fish in a row, and I'm bringing my hooks in, I'm checking to make sure that they're still sharp. Obviously there's no bugs hatching that I can see at all. So eventually what I did was I took the closest thing that I had to the swivel, which was a number 16 black chronomid with a black bead, and I hung it down at the same depth that my swivel was sitting. And sure enough, I mean, just started creaming them, one fish after another. And I don't even know how many we landed in the last, you know, we only had about an hour of light left, but every take was absolutely savage. It was, yeah, I mean, it was just amazing. So ever since then, I've become pretty mindful of, you know, pay attention when that indicator is going down and popping back up right away. Unless they're really soft mouthing it, a lot of times that's going to be, it's going to be a grab on your swivel.
Yeah, because that also could tell you your fly's literally too far down if you're consistently getting that to happen. And one of the cures is just shorten it up 2 feet so your fly is hanging 2 feet higher. Now the fish are cruising where your fly is now where the fish are cruising. So it can work that way. And that last color, I also, when chironomids are hatching and they're inflated and they're shiny, I'll put a silver one on, because it's going to catch light and attract, like a dodger that salmon anglers use on the ocean. It's the same thing. It's a flasher, rather. It's same thing that way. So important part. Okay, bobber stops. What the heck is Phil talking about? These are bobber stops, okay? And one of the issues we have when we are fishing indicators is you catch a fish, you trip your indicator, and I want to put it back where it was before so I can get right back and catch more fish. And this is a way we use these to mark indicators. These you'll find in the dark side over where the non-fly fishing stuff is in a Cabela's or a Bass Pro or your favorite fishing shop. And they are used by conventional anglers for slip bobber systems, and bass fishermen use them when they're using those heavy tungsten weights to plunge cover, so that heavy tungsten weight at the end of their leader doesn't slide up. So what they are is they're dispensed on a little wire loop like this. I'll pull it back a bit so you can see. So what you do is when you're building your leader, no matter what style you choose to use, I'll put them down here against my black shirt. You see this loop, you put these on first. This goes on the very first, you put your leader on, then you put these bobber stops. So I'm going to take my leader and I pass it through the wire loop, right? I isolate one I want to use. So I push this through the wire loop, and then I grab just an inch or two, and then I'm going to grab the rubber stop and pull on it, right? And this is a little thick, so it's going to be a little challenging to do, but I wanted so you could see the leader and get all the spit off there. So I pulled on the rubber stopper, right? And then this is going to eventually come off the, come off the wire, and now it's folded over onto the leader, okay? And I just keep pulling this. You can moisten it a bit for a little lubrication. Keep it moist, and then just keep pulling on it and pulling on it, and eventually it flips off, right? The little doubled ends come out the other side, and now you've transferred this onto your leader. And then you just move this way up the leader, and when I set my indicator, so I've got my quick release indicator on here, right? And I get it where I want to go, so let's say that's 6 feet. Okay, that's where I'm going to do. So I pop this back, lock my indicator in place. Okay, so my hand side is where the fly is. There's the bobber stopper between the indicator and the fly line. I just slide the bobber stopper down to there. I catch a fish, boom, it pops. I fight, I land it. All I got to do to get right back where it was take that indicator back up to the bobber stopper, disengage, fold, and I'm fishing again. And I'm at exactly the same depth I was before. Very handy thing to have. Because we all get paranoid if we don't, we're going to show you how to reset the depth next to make sure you're deadly accurate. But once you invest that time, you don't want to be doing it after you catch every fish, right? We want to be fishing, not setting gear up all day long. Again, so that's why we use these rubberized bobber stoppers. So they're between the fly line and the indicator. You don't want them between the indicator and the fly, because that bobber stopper obviously is going to stop this peg from sliding down, and now it doesn't work like a quick release indicator should.
Pretty innovative stuff.
Oh, yeah. One nugget per night. All right, setting indicator depth. Some general rules. If I'm over a muddy bottom, or I suspect to be flat and level, I'm probably going to start 1 foot above the bottom. If my bottom is irregular, meaning there could be rocks, logs, tufts of weeds, that kind of thing, probably maybe 2 feet, 18 inches up, so I can factor in that irregularity so I'm not hanging up. And then if I'm over, say, weed tops like this, you've got weeds growing up, 10 feet of water, 2 feet of weeds in there, I'm going to hang a foot above the weeds, okay? Those are general guidelines. And typically, the bigger the fly, the more grace you're going to get with your sets, because a fish will move a little further for more perceived calorie value. But little tiny size 14, 16 chironomids, more likely is going to be fishing in a narrower zone because it's just not worth the effort to go get it, right? I'm going to walk across the room to get a steak. If somebody's got jelly beans, I'm going to ask them to throw them to me because I'm too lazy to get up and go get them, right? Bit of a poor analogy, but just like that. But there are times you're going to want to really set your indicator. And this is where that, I saw some questions on the page today about, where the heck have I put the dumb thing? Oh, I know where it is. These guys, the depth indicators, locators, or weight, or whatever you're going to use. So what we do for this is we're going to approximately set our indicator. So this step one, if you will. So let's say I'm in 12 feet of water, and I decide I want to set a foot off the bottom. So I arbitrarily, ruler, whatever you want to do, you get it set up. So I'm in 12 feet. I want to set my indicator. So my distance between my indicator and my fly is 11 feet. I set it up. I think I got it right. But you want to check. So what you do now is you take your weight and clip it carefully to the fly so you don't damage it. And then you lower this over the side of the boat. It's going to go down to the bottom. And because it weighs more than it overpowers the buoyancy of the indicator, it's going to pull it under. So now this weight is sitting on the bottom and your indicator is sitting here, and then that's the surface. So the distance between the surface and this indicator is going to translate when you take the weight off, because the indicator will come up, to the distance between here and the bottom. So you're going to make a judgment whether you think that's too deep or too shallow. And then you're going to adjust your indicator, right? You may reattach the weight to confirm it. And now that confirms that the distance is correct. I've got to the foot I wanted. Here, it's a little exaggerated, but I'm not going to be deep enough when I hang. So I put the weight on, pulls it under. I gauge this. If this distance between the indicator and the surface appears to be too deep, I'm going to adjust the indicator upwards, closer to the surface, reposition it, lower it again to confirm. That looks about a foot down, my indicator. That's right. I'm going to unclip this off my fly, make my cast, and go fishing. And of course, slide my bobber stopper down to that point. So that's how you set your indicator. It works great if you don't have a sounder and you're not sure how deep you are, right? It's sort of a, economical sounder. And of course, this is assuming around you is relatively flat. I wouldn't necessarily do this, be more experimentation if I was fishing my indicator from a shallow location over into a deeper location. Or sometimes you gently cruise around and sort of map the area and get a measure of where your bottom is and then set for that. You always want to set where you're fishing, not where you're sitting. And again, these are all anchored techniques, okay? All anchored. We don't troll or drift with this stuff.
Yeah.
Okay.
So just a couple more points here. So sometimes a glare, and I would definitely just say fluctuation in light settings too, because sometimes in low light there's certain indicators that work better, sometimes in bright sun. So much of this comes down to personal preference. So for me, the only two indicators that I can see in pretty much any light condition are pink and orange. And I know that they're in red, they're in yellow. The only exception to this being in low light, and kind of if you get towards that witching hour, sometimes I have had times where I've fished a green indicator, and I can see it a little bit better. But for the most part, I mean, hot orange and hot pink, as long as you're not spooking fish, and when you've got that light coming over top, when those indicators are front lit, when it's coming at your back, it just lights them up like crazy at that fluorescent paint on them. And the fun thing when you look up sometimes and your indicator is down with those really, really bright ones, you can still see them like 5 or 6 feet under the surface of the water. You can definitely bring a marker with you for adjusting things on the water. And sometimes what I've done too is I've had some times where in very, very shallow water, fishing, typically I'll fish with like a small corky if the fish are really spooky. And typically what I'll do is I'll have a bright one and I'll actually paint the bottom of it to make it as just non-obtrusive as possible. And leaving so I can see the bright part and the fish, just looks like a floating pebble. Not that they've ever seen one of those. But.
Yeah. Where I came across this trick of using a marker to color, on the water adjustment was fishing Pyramid Lake in Nevada. It's a very high alkaline lake. It's got the weed growth in there is a real pale, watery lime green. And any bright indicator, orange, sunburst orange, hot pink, you couldn't see it. It just reflected back. It got lost in the glare. And the locals took their thingamabobbers. That was the indicator they used most often down there at the time when I was there. They took a black marker to it, paint job, and all of a sudden it's silhouetted and stuck out like a sore thumb.
Yeah.
So that's the reason for glare. If you're fishing in a bright light or the water coloration itself just makes your indicator hard to see, you just simply, the beauty of this is you hold it by the peg and take a marker and turn it from hot orange to black in the blink of an eye, right? So again, more value for why you'd have some of that stuff in your kit bag.
Yeah.
The other thing is these indicators, the quick release indicators, you keep putting that peg in multiple times, it starts to expand the hole in the indicator. Usually that's a good thing because it means that indicator's been popping a lot, which means you've been catching a lot of fish. And it's a good problem, but you're ultimately going to have to change that indicator at some point, but not right now because the fishing's good. Who wants to rebuild their indicator at that moment in time? So what you do is you take a short section of black electrician's tape, make a couple of wraps around the black peg. That enlarges the diameter of the peg. Now it fits snugly back in the indicator again. It's a temporary fix. It keeps you in the game. And when the fishing slows or it's time to go home, then you're going to change that indicator out. But this is a short-term fix because the fishing's good, and who wants to be taking everything apart at that point in the game, right? You want to keep fishing. So
Right.
just a handy thing to have on board. If you find your indicator or maybe you're down to your last ones, you're like, crap, I got to make this thing last, right, until I can go get some more. The black electrician's tape can help save the day for you.
So casting indicators, this is definitely something that gets quite a bit of, we get a lot of inquiry about this. And I always tell people that the biggest mistake that you see is people trying to cast too far, carry too much line in the air. A lot of times when you're fishing this catatonic presentation, I'm not casting any more than 30 feet for the most part. If I'm fishing very, very super shallow water, very spooky fish, sometimes I'll fish a little bit further, but for the most part, I mean, you're going to find a lot of times you're going to be popping your indicator on your cast. You are going to be wrapping the swivel and the indicator and the fly. You're going to be wrapping them all up together. So usually when I'm showing somebody how to cast this long leader setup with a strike indicator, I'm getting them to roll cast right away. And the reason for that is that the less time that setup spends going back and forth in the air, the less time that it spends up in the air, the better the chance you're going to have of everything turning over properly. The nice thing is, for the most part, I mean, your target is the water, right? We're not precision casting a lot of the time, so you don't have to throw these nice tight little loops, right? You can really open your loop, and what we mean by open your loop is really separating the tip of the rod from basically lessening your chances of anything running into itself, right? And you've seen, I've definitely seen my fair share of barrel swivels hit the rod blank, which can definitely bruise that graphite quite easily. You really don't have to, especially, this is where we go back to the very first lesson. When you have your equipment dialed in for this type of fishing, you don't have to apply a lot of force. You don't have to apply a lot of push, a lot of effort. It's actually really quite easy to cast an indicator in 20 some feet of leader. But for me, definitely, I'm a huge fan of just get that big, nice, slow lift with the rod tip, and basically one move forward, and the grain weight from that floating line, especially a floating line that's designed for this type of fishing, is just going to help flip everything over. And if you see everything land separately, just fish it. The last thing that I want to say about this too, just while we're here, is that picking up and recasting for the sake of picking up and recasting is actually more of a curse rather than a blessing, because you factor in the amount of time it takes for that presentation to get down to where the fish are feeding. I used to fish with a friend of mine, Billy, great guy. We've fished together all the time. And we'd be fishing 20 feet of water, and he'd just pick up his line and cast, 3 minutes after it landed, right? So the fly probably just got down in front of their face, and he'd pick it up and he'd make another cast, and then he'd sit there. He wouldn't put his rod in the holder. He'd get really fidgety. And finally one day I said, you got to just let it do its thing down there. I know that wasn't on the list, but sometimes when these things leave my brain, they leave for quite a long period of time. So that's all I've got to say about that.
Yeah. The roll pickup at the end, you'll find when you indicator fish with a balanced fly sinks very fast. It's tungsten. So you don't have the luxury of sort of letting that line you know, you may do an initial cast to get it out. Now you're going to pick it up and go, or you're going to roll cast. This is more often happens when it roll casts. You're going to have to do what's called a roll pickup. So you go into a roll motion and push to a stop. The line doesn't cast. What it does is, the first part of it is it's going to cycle that fly up to the top of the water where you can pick it out. And then once it's up near the surface, then you can load it up. If you try and haul a balanced fly at a 12, 14, 15 feet, it's not going to come out of the water. It's starting to act more like a sinking line than a floating line setup, right? So you just to make that easier. And sometimes, you know, when I fish walleye, we indicator fish with big balanced flies. These are ends justify the mean stuff. They are not fun to throw on a thin level leader, especially. And some people get all worried because we've all been taught that a fly line must roll out like this, like river runs through it. And what I say is cast the indicator. So I've got that fly anchored down below. I'll go into the roll cast. I'll just push. The fly line will roll over. The indicator kind of jumps and lands, and you've made the cast. Because what happens, as soon as that indicator lands, that fly sinks straight below it from 360 possible angles. Right? So don't worry if the fly doesn't come out of the water necessarily.
Yeah.
You're going to recast again. Just flop the indicator out there. Again, it's not pretty. You're not going to win any casting competitions or get on the cover of Fly Fisherman magazine or something, but it works and the fly's in the water. The beauty of the roll cast for indicator fishing is the fly and all that thin stuff and all the other junk we've got on the leader only comes out at the final turnover. The more times you put that rig in the air with traditional overhand casting, the more something can go wrong.
100%.
Yeah. So yeah, less is more, keep it short and use the right line for the job.
Yep.
All right, retrieves. Most people associate indicator fishing with heave it and leave it, you know, and that works a lot of times, but you can move the fly and in many instances you probably should move it. So just some guidelines here. I tend to heave it and leave it. So cast it out and let it sit static. If it's really cold water and the fish are inactive, or you've had a weather change come in, something, the fish are not moving very much. So you just got to let something hang there and eventually let one cruise by and put it in its mouth. You're going to use the hand twist or the pinch strip we talked about last night, literally to get your fly out and bring it back towards you. So your flies are tracking through the water back to you and covering water that way. If the fish are a little more active or you haven't caught a fish in a while, this is a way to induce a take. So you literally take with a strip retrieve, make about a 6 to 12 inch pull like that. So the indicator actually creates a wake and then you stop it. And what happens is you strip it, the fly rises up and then you stop, it falls back down. And that rise fall action can attract fish because they're sight feeders. They see that movement, they come over to check it out, and they like it and they eat it. So when you do this method, you strip and you never take your hand away, your eyes away rather, from the indicator as it settles, because that's usually when you get plowed, right? This is not the time to look away like this. You want to stare at that because it's inducing a take. And as Jordan said a few sessions ago, if the winds are light, you can actually cast upwind. Because remember, fish like to cruise into the wind, so you can cast upwind and just let everything drift back towards you. All you do is gather in the slack and watch that indicator go under. Great for leeches and bait fish. Things that would swim downwind, or a scud or something, or a damsel, those would work very well. And typically I'm fishing downwind. I'm fishing the first 3 all together until I figure out what they like. So cast out, let it sit still. I get bored. The last bullet. When second you get bored, the cure for boredom is do something, and the do something is move the fly. Because when you get bored, you start looking up, away, fidgeting with things, and that's when you're going to get the take. You're going to turn back, your indicator's gone, and rather than react, most times we just sort of lean in and stare harder, trying to wonder where the hell it went, and then whoop, it pops back up and you miss the fish. So I'm going to cast out, let it sit, nothing happens, a little bit of a hand twist, let it sit, nothing happens, maybe give it a pull, nothing happens, let it sit, and so on and so on. So just keep chopping and changing until you figure something out. You just don't heave it and leave it. And as we talked about last night, final thing, you can wind drift this whole thing. Remember the cast, mend, and let it swing down and come back? this is a prime tactic to use with indicator techniques. You get movement in the fly then. Just like anything else, we're trying to cover as much water as we can to find fish. Wrap her up, Jordan.
Beautiful. So yeah, in this lesson, we basically covered, you know, the importance of the how, what, when, why you're going to be fishing indicators. I really want people to be diligent in considering your leader construction, and remembering that the more vertical you can get that hang, the better the longer that fly is going to sit, and the quicker it's going to get into that strike zone. And I know that's probably just the most cliche fishing term that's ever been used, the strike zone. Anyways, yeah, so I'll try to put up a demo video of casting with indicators too. Next time I'm on the water. Is not going to be tomorrow, maybe in the next few days here. And yeah, just to kind of iterate what opening that loop looks like.
Yeah, there was a question, a good comment by Grandma and Grandpa. A Belgian loop or a continuous tension cast works very well. So if you're not familiar with a Belgian loop, you're going to bring your fly back on the back cast, kind of off on a diagonal, around in a loop like this.
Yeah.
And don't pause the rod. Ow, that hurts my shoulder right now. Come around and then over the top. So it's around, like, and then over the top, and you never stop. It's a that's why one of the terms is a continuous motion. So up and around and over the top like that. So you kind of sling it away from you on the side and then over top into the target. So that's another great cast as well. And you cast minimally with this stuff. Do not, if you're casting more than, I'd say even more than twice, 2 false casts, you're overdoing it.
Yeah. Awesome.
I
know that we went.
Mending in wind only works when wind's coming from one direction. Yeah, the wind has to be consistent. If it's swirling around, like sometimes happens in bays, it can be a problem. And sometimes I don't cast. I wait till it does whatever it's going to do, and then it settles down and comes a little more consistent. You know, if it's, you start to see a pattern. Every once in a while you get a gust and things go around in circles and does what, I just sit and wait. Right? Just depends how strong it is. Don't fight the wind. Let it work. Yeah. It can be your friend if you let it work with you. When it starts to become your enemy, it's because you're starting to fight it and try to force your stuff to do things it won't do, and that becomes a problem.
Yeah.
Phil, sorry.
Oh no, go ahead.
It says, Phil, could you run over your deep water braid indicator rig? Okay, I left this one out because it's more of an advanced technique, but you will find, because the leaders we're using are primarily nylon based, and in conjunction with a line that doesn't stretch and a soft rod, when that indicator when you're fishing, let's say 18 or 19 feet underneath your indicator, there's a lot of stretch in the system. So when you go to set, the quick release indicator works on tension. And if there's not enough tension, it won't pop, or it won't pop consistently. So now it's not releasing anymore. It's bloody frustrating. So what we do is you can build a level leader out of 20 to 30 pound braid, and I'm talking Fireline or P-line, you know, any of those braids they use for conventional fishing, right? And then you attach that to your swivel, and then you maybe have 3 or 4 feet of tippet underneath. And what you've added is a no stretch section to your leader. So when you set the hook, it will release. Yeah. This is an ends justify the means presentation. It's short casts. We typically only roll cast, and it could be no more than 20 feet. Often it's 10 feet from fly line from rod tip to indicator, because you're fishing deep. You don't need to power it far away. The fish are quite happy cruising underneath your boat, unless you're having a graduation party or something. Yeah. And so you set, because if you get a tangle in braid, oh, it's ugly. You got to cut it out. So no, you don't. I don't actually traditionally cast that setup at all. It's all roll cast, right? Yeah. But it's, if you're having issues fishing deep water and your indicator not releasing, that's add a full section of braid, or maybe the adjustment section in my leader is braid. Yeah. Right. I just put a little no stretch in it, and then you can use a tippet ring and you play around. It's an advanced fiddly system. It's almost best to sit beside you and show you, and it's circumstantial how long things are in it. All depends on how deep I'm fishing below it. It's on our app. Yeah. Awesome, you guys. I know we went a little bit over our time.
But yeah, if you guys have questions, you can throw them in the group here. Obviously, I'll get everybody's. I will get the video out to everybody. Sorry, we had a bit of an issue with YouTube last night or this morning. I couldn't get the file to upload, but yeah, so we sent it out this evening. I'll have this one out to everybody tomorrow morning, and we'll have your notes. And I think we'll see you again here tomorrow night.
Yeah, we got the naked technique, and this is, I know it took long to echo Jordan's, but this is arguably the most important session.
Yeah.
Particularly the leader, because this is such a popular method nowadays. If it's not working for you, it's probably your leader setup. If you're not catching and somebody else is, and you seem to be doing all the same thing,
For sure.
First place to go is have a look at that leader.
Awesome, you guys. Have a great evening. Thank you so much for coming out. See you tomorrow night.
Go pee
Sleep
now,
tight. Happy Mother's Day. Oh God, I can't wait. No, I'm gonna go watch a movie with the wife. Okay, you guys have a great night.